From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Sue Siegel. I am the Director of Development at the Library of Congress. Welcome. It's my distinct honor to introduce to you the gentleman who is most responsible for bringing you the National Book Festival, the co-chairman of the National Book Festival, and the co-founder and co-CEO of the Carlyle Group, David Rubenstein.
Thank you. So, thank you. We're very privileged and honored today to have Evan Thomas as our special guest. And let me give you a little background on Evan. Evan is a journalist by trade. He graduated from Phillips Academy, Harvard College, University of Virginia Law School, and decided, as I did, that maybe the practice of law wasn't such a great thing. And so he worked at Newsweek as a journalist and an editor for almost a quarter century, 24 years, and had a distinguished career there. He began writing books while he was there and has now written 9 books, a number of biographies, including biographies on Robert Kennedy, President Eisenhower, Edward Bennett Williams, John Paul Jones, and most recently on Richard Nixon. His new book is Being Nixon. Evan is, among other things, a grandson of Norman Thomas, who was for 6 times ran as President of the United States on the socialist ticket. So, and I guess if you were around today and winning, he'd probably be in the Democratic primary and doing quite well, right? Okay. So, Evan, most people who are biographers, and they kind of fall in love with their subject, and after they spend 2 or 3 years with the subject, they actually find wonderful things about this subject. So now, having spent 3.5 years with Richard Nixon, do you admire him more than you did before, or do you admire him less than you did before?
I admire him more, but obviously it was a low baseline.
Okay.
You know, like a lot of people, I had a low opinion of Richard Nixon because I'd been in college when Watergate was going on, and it was pretty disgraceful, and I'd taken on much of the lore of Nixon as a wicked figure in American history. As I got into it, Nixon had a dark side for sure. I mean, obviously. And he was a troubled guy in many ways. But he was also human and a person who wanted to be a better person than he was. And he wasn't just faking that. He really did want to be a better person than he was. And he was in many ways. For one thing, he served his country for many, many years. And he accomplished a lot. He destroyed himself in the end. But he was a more, I wouldn't say tragic figure, because maybe he's not great enough to be a tragic figure, but he was a more poignant figure than I had realized.
Now, the people about whom you've written biographies, did you actually ever meet any of those when you were writing them, or at some point?
Yes, in my group biography with Walter Isaacson, we met some of the wise men.
Okay.
But no, generally I write books about people who are no longer with us.
It's easier to deal with them, right?
It actually is.
Right. So let me ask you about Richard Nixon. Did you ever meet Richard Nixon?
I did once. He came to Newsweek on one of his rehabilitation tours, 1988, when he was fascinatingly trying to resurrect himself from a low point. And he came by, and this was typical Nixon. Somebody had given him the list of people there, maybe 30 or 40 people. He'd studied every name. He researched it. He was prepared. And when he was finished, he came over to me, and he said to me, "Your grandfather was a great man." And I was kind of taken aback that he knew, I mean, he did this. And I was flattered by it. It worked. And it gave me a little tiny insight into, although Richard Nixon was one of the most shy, socially awkward men who ever lived, he compensated for it by, one, remembering names, which was really useful for a politician, and also just doing the homework. He did the work.
Well, let's think about it. He was very shy. Why would somebody so shy and introverted have gone into politics?
Well, that's a right good question, because he was so shy it was physically painful for him to be. People would meet him, and sometimes he couldn't even speak. He would just spin his hands. He would make awkward jokes, often awkward, sort of tasteless jokes. He would blurt out things. He went to Martin Luther King's funeral, and he ran into Jacqueline Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Kennedy, this must bring back many memories." You know, yeah, I mean, we all do this kind of thing, but he would do it all the time. But so your question is, why did he do it? Actors are often shy. He was an actor. He was an actor in college, and it was a way of compensating, I suppose, for his shyness. He was a risk taker. He loved plunging into crowds. He loved plunging into hostile crowds. He almost got killed in Venezuela by an angry mob. He was quite brave in it. So he was motivated to sort of overcome his shyness.
Much of your book deals with the relationship he had with his mother, and I guess you could say everybody's relationship with their mother probably has some impact, but let's go back to his time in California. He grows up in a relatively poor family, has several brothers. Right. Tell us about his mother and father.
Well, his dad was a bully, kind of a loud bully who bullied people, including his mother. His mother was quiet, and Nixon always said that she was saintly, but if you read into the family histories, she was sort of passive-aggressive saintly. She was withholding, and when she would nurture grudges, and when she gave you the silent treatment, it was worse than being bullied by the father. And Nixon got caught between these. Henry Kissinger said, what would have happened if Richard Nixon had been loved? Would he have been a different person? I think that's a little bit harsh. I think he was loved, but he was never comfortable. He never got the sense of Richard Nixon. You know this phrase, the well-loved child? Richard Nixon was not a well-loved child. So
he goes to high school, in a public high school, and he's an actor and a bit of an athlete.
Well, not much of an athlete.
Did he play football? Or
he was cannon fodder, as they say. He was sort of courageous about it because he got kicked around. He was funny about this. He was contradictory in so many ways. He would say, I don't like being around intellectuals because there's something feminine about them. I like to talk to athletes. Well, he was a terrible athlete, but he was an intellectual. And he actually was good with intellectuals.
So he went to Whittier College, local school, and then he applied to Harvard Law School and got into Harvard.
Well, he got into Harvard College. He would have gotten in. He won a Harvard Prize in high school, which meant he would have gotten in. But there was no money to go there.
And there were no scholarships in those days?
There were scholarships, but his parents were so broke there was not enough money to get him from California to Boston.
All right, so he graduates from Whittier, and then he applies to law school, and he ultimately took a scholarship at Duke Law School.
He did.
He graduates from there, comes back, decides not to practice law in the East, or?
He didn't get a job. He went to Wall Street. This is sort of a crushing scene. He was third in his class at Duke Law School. He goes up to the big Wall Street law firms, and they don't want him because he's badly dressed, he's not cool, and he has a scene at Sullivan and Cromwell waiting in the outer office with the thick Oriental rugs, feeling small and pathetic and unwanted, which was true. He was not wanted.
So he goes back to California, and then how does he begin a political career?
Well, he goes into he's a sort of an unsuccessful young lawyer, goes into the Navy in World War II, behind the lines, not heroic. But he gets out, and he's an aggressive, handsome young man, and he's a good debater, and the local Republicans are looking for somebody to run against a longtime incumbent, and they audition him, and he's ready to go, and they pick him. He's a long shot, but he wins. Right,
so he wins and goes to Congress, and he's entering class as John Kennedy?
He is.
And he had a good relationship those days with John Kennedy?
Yes, I mean, they're poles apart in so many ways, so it's kind of an odd friendship, but Nixon recognized something kindred, that Kennedy was shy. Kennedy was shy like him. He was a lot more glamorous, but he was also shy. And they had a kind of a bond of young war veterans coming to Washington, caring about foreign policy. They were close until they were not close.
Okay, and then how does his career move forward? What happens that elevates his career? There are lots of congressmen who are, intelligent people, but what happened to him?
He discovers Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was a Harvard Law School elegant figure, State Department, who was accused of being a communist spy in a congressional hearing. Nobody believed it. Only Nixon kept pursuing Hiss, and his relentless pursuit brought Hiss down. Now, it did two things. One is it was an early sign of the Republican right going after communists in government, so it elevated Nixon's political stature mightily, but at least in Nixon's eyes, incurred the everlasting wrath of the Eastern establishment, which was embarrassed. Hiss was one of theirs. Hiss was a Harvard Law School guy, friends of Dean Acheson. And the East Coast establishment was embarrassed by Nixon, and according to Nixon, they never forgave him.
So but it elevates him, and then in 1950, he has a chance to run for the Senate.
He does.
And who does he run against?
Helen Gahagan Douglas, who was a beautiful woman, actually. She had an affair with LBJ. And she was the favorite, again, had the money. And Johnson and Nixon ran a fairly rough campain against her as the
He
pink
called her
lady.
Pink Lady,
the
meaning
pink lady.
the implication being she was...
Famously quoted as saying that she was pink right down to her underwear. Now, there's some historical, as in all these good stories, there's some dispute about whether he actually said that. But that was the legend, and it stuck to him in the sense that he played dirty. That he played hard and he played dirty. He didn't play as dirty as the myth suggested, but he could play dirty.
So he wins.
He wins.
And then he becomes a senator. So he's a senator in like 1950. How does he go from being a senator who's just serving 1 or 2 years to on the ticket in 1952? How did that happen?
He could deliver California to Eisenhower, and he was a bridge to the right. Eisenhower was a moderate Republican, something that no longer exists. But in those days, there were a lot of moderate Republicans, but they had to mind their right wing, and Nixon was well positioned with the right, and Nixon was sort of a bridge figure, and so he was a logical choice. Now, there was no personal chemistry between Eisenhower and Nixon at all.
So in your book, you point out that Eisenhower didn't even know that he had the right to pick the vice president.
Right. Eisenhower was new to politics. He was the last remember this Donald Trump. Eisenhower was the last non-politician to make it to the presidency.
Had he met Nixon before he picked him?
Barely. Nixon had briefed him once, or rather Eisenhower had briefed Nixon in one of these congressional junkets, and he had a minimal impression of him. And poor Nixon made the mistake of coming in and being jovial and saying to Eisenhower, "Hi, Chief." That didn't go down with Eisenhower.
So he's 39 years old when he's picked. He's running for vice president 39. I think that's right. Yeah. What happened? The campaign's moving forward. Eisenhower's going to win, and all of a sudden some scandal emerges. And what happened?
It was a bogus scandal. Allegedly, that Nixon had a slush fund to pay his political expenses. It was a bogus scandal, but it got into the press, and it took on a kind of momentum, and Eisenhower almost dumped Nixon from the ticket on the advice of his advisors that somehow Nixon was going to drag Eisenhower down. And so Nixon had to save himself by going on national TV, new thing then, and giving a speech that became known as the Checkers speech, famous speech. And it was so interesting because it was to many ears, some ears, maudlin and mawkish, to East Coast establishment ears. But to the vast majority of voters, it was moving and affecting, and it kept him on the ticket.
And the Checkers was referring to the dog that he had been given. What did he say?
He said that the allegation was that he'd been given money, and he said, "Well, we did get a dog, and my children love this dog named Checkers, and we're not giving him back." And it was, it was kind of...
Now, in the context of today, it might seem small, but were we talking about a couple $1 million in the slush fund?
No, 18,000. I mean, nothing. I mean, it was nothing. And Adlai Stevenson, his opponent, had a bigger slush fund, which he used to pay for a dance for his son.
Okay. So they win the election, and he's vice president. So does he get an office in the West Wing, and he's hanging out with Eisenhower, making policy decisions?
No. Vice presidents, especially in those days, didn't really do a damn thing. But Eisenhower did actually use Nixon a little bit more than usual, brought him into the tent more than Harry Truman, say, under FDR, used him to go abroad, to deliver messages to foreign leaders. And this was great for Nixon because he got a lot of face time with foreign leaders, and it built his confidence.
Okay. But when they come for re-election in 1956, Eisenhower says, well, maybe you'd like to be Secretary of Defense in the second term or something else. What was that about?
Extremely painful. Eisenhower was viewing Nixon as sort of a young colonel who needed some management experience. Go to be Secretary of Defense. He thought he was doing him a favor. The way Nixon saw it was, he's dumping me. The headline's going to be, Ike dumps Nixon. So Nixon just refused to take the bait. He stalled. He didn't get off the ticket. It went on for months. Nixon got psychosomatically sick. He ended up at Walter Reed with all sorts of aches and pains. It was excruciating for him to be seemingly to be dumped this way. In the end, Ike kept him, but it was very painful for Nixon.
Well, Eisenhower was a general, supreme Allied commander. Why come he couldn't just say, I want this, and that's going to be what it's going to be? How come he didn't do that?
Well, as you know, politics doesn't work that way.
So he stays on the ticket wins, and then Eisenhower can only serve 2 terms because of a new constitutional amendment. So there's this debate about who's going to be the Republican nominee in 1960, and was Nixon the clear first choice and front runner?
Really the only choice. He was it. He was a consensus. He was very good about raising money and campaigning for other candidates. So he had picked up a lot of IOUs by traveling, by being Eisenhower's hatchet man in 52 and 56, saying all the rough stuff that Ike didn't want to say. So he had a lot of friends in the party, so he was the natural candidate.
So Eisenhower endorses him wholeheartedly?
No. At a press conference in August, so Nixon is now running for president, and at a press conference, President Eisenhower is asked, well, can you tell us something that Dick Nixon did to advance American foreign policy? And Eisenhower says, if you give me a week, I'll think of something. You know, it's crushing to Nixon.
Did they ever try to reverse that statement?
Yeah. I mean, Eisenhower tried to say, well, I was just kidding.
Right.
It was just painful.
So the decision to have debates, talk about that. Presidents hadn't had debates before. Who issued the challenge, and why did Nixon, as actually the front runner at the time for the election, why did he agree to debate?
Yeah, I mean, big mistake. He should not have given it the debate. Front runners, shouldn't allow the challenger. But he thought he thought that Jack Kennedy was a bit of a dilettante, a bit of a daddy's boy, weak. He watched him give his acceptance speech to the Democratic National Convention, and he thought it wasn't very good. And he thought, I can take this guy. I'm good on TV, I'm quicker on my feet, I know more. He did not understand television well enough.
So he shows up for the first debate in Chicago, and he gets a lot of makeup?
Well, the makeup guy asked Kennedy, said, do you want some makeup? And Kennedy says, nah. Kennedy's tanned and handsome. Kennedy actually goes back and gets some fancy makeup behind the scenes. They asked Nixon, do you want some makeup? And Kennedy said no, so Nixon says no. Nixon goes back behind the scenes and says, quick, go down to get me some shave stick. Shave stick is this kind of hideous stuff that you smear to cover your 5 o'clock shadow. So they smear on the shave stick, and of course, under the hot lights, he starts to sweat. And the sweat is dribbling through the shave stick. And meanwhile, Kennedy's sitting over there, Mr. Cool, and it was just devastating.
But some people say if you listened to the debate on radio, you would have thought Nixon won. So did it make that much difference that Nixon didn't look so good in the first debate?
It made historians debate this. Probably the debates, there were 4 debates, they were probably a wash. But that first debate, Kennedy did not look like a spoiled rich boy. He looked presidential. He looked cool and presidential. And Nixon looked sweaty and furtive, and that hurt.
In that campaign, Nixon made a promise that he was going to campaign in all 50 states. Did that hurt him?
Big mistake. I mean, because a lot of states he was going to win or lose regardless, but he made the mistake of managing his own campaign. Always a mistake. He learned otherwise, and he exhausted himself, and he kind of ran out of gas.
So the election results come in, and it's very close. At the end of the night, midnight, nobody knows who wins. In the end, it becomes very close. What happens, and why did Nixon not contest the election?
Well, it's actually a good Nixon story. As many of you know, there's a lot of historical evidence that Chicago, there was vote fraud, and that Kennedy carried Illinois by stealing the vote, by not Kennedy, but his minions, Daley, stealing the vote in
Daley
Illinois.
said, with the help of a few friends, we might win.
That was the famous, with the help of a few friends, we're going to win. Well, they were dead friends. It was a graveyard vote. In one district, Kennedy got more votes than people living there. In Texas, there was also some voter fraud. But Nixon, as you said, did not contest the election because we were in the middle of a Cold War. He didn't want to put the country through this. He did the honorable thing and accepted the outcome.
Okay, so he's 47 years old. He served 8 years as vice president, a couple years as senator, a couple years as a member of the House. What happens to him? Where does he go? To New York, California?
He becomes a lawyer.
The highest calling of mankind,
yeah.
Right?
And he's bored by it. He's making some money.
In what city is he
in
living?
Los Angeles. He goes back to LA to make some dough. And his family is pleased with that. He writes a book called 6 Crises, which is all about his love of crisis. But he's bored and restless. Then he moves to New York to make some more money as a bigger lawyer.
But he ran for governor.
He ran for governor.
In 62, he ran for governor. What happened in that in California?
Big mistake, because his heart wasn't really in it. He loses to Jerry Brown's father, Governor Brown, and famously at a press conference the next morning, he stands up and he says, well, you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. And the press is kind of appalled by it. Nixon's clearly hungover. He's being sarcastic. They write his obituary. It's the end of Nixon.
So he moves to New York, start life all over again. He joins a large law firm renamed Nixon, Mudge, Guthrie, and Alexander.
Right.
And what does he do as a lawyer? Does he really have clients?
Yeah, he does. He's mostly a rainmaker. You know, he's mostly getting Pepsi and his buddies could give into his campaigns. But he argues in the Supreme Courts. He loses a case, but he argues well, called Time v. Hill. He's a real lawyer. He's not just a rainmaker. He's very smart and he's hardworking. Okay,
so in 1966, he starts campaigning for Republican candidates, and the Republicans do well, and what happens then?
Well, he picks up a lot of IOUs, and he wants back in. He famously, he goes off with his pal Leonard Garment, who's another lawyer. And this is typical. Garment couldn't be more different from Nixon. He's a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, a Democrat, but he and Nixon are pals. And they go off one night to give a speech, and Nixon they end up driving to a contributor's home. It's middle of the night. The place is all locked up. Nixon says, over the wall we go, Leonard, throws his briefcase over the wall. They climb over in their wingtips. They end up spending the night in the pool house. It's like summer camp, according to Garment. And Nixon stays up all night telling Garment that if he doesn't get back into public service, he's going to be mentally dead in 2 years and physically dead in 4. He just had to get back into public life.
So he runs in '68, and who was the logical front runner then? Was he the front runner or somebody else?
Well, Rockefeller, Romney, there are other candidates. Nixon wisely kind of lays low. It's 1967, 68. It's a very hot time in this country. Romney Sr., this is George Romney, finally self-destructs. Rockefeller equivocates. Reagan is not really ready yet. And Nixon is the default choice. And Nixon has wisely picked up all these IOUs from the party. And Nixon reinvents himself as the new Nixon, who is cool and confident and not a hothead. And it works. It convinces enough people that this is the real Nixon.
So he gets elected and beats Hubert Humphrey. So then he's finally got the presidency. How did he decide to organize the White House? Did he decide to let everybody meet with him, or did he have a tough chief of staff? What was the organizational structure?
Well, Nixon did not like people. And so he created a structure so that there were as few people as possible dealing with him. So really, his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, creates this structure where it all runs through Haldeman. Haldeman was in many ways a great chief of staff, with the significant exception of Watergate. But he did run a tight White House for a while, and Nixon liked to be alone, and he would talk to Haldeman and also to Kissinger. Those were the two men he talked to all the time.
Henry Kissinger had been an advisor to John Kennedy on the outside. He was an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller. How did he transition from being a moderate Democrat to a moderate Republican to being Nixon's national security advisor? And how did he get the job?
Well, Kissinger's a clever fellow, and he played both sides of the street. He even leaked a little bit. He was an advisor to the White House on negotiations over the Vietnam War. And Kissinger leaked what he was doing to the Nixon camp. So he endeared himself that way, got to know Nixon's national security advisor. And to Nixon's credit, Nixon liked smart guys to advise him. I mean, I've said that he doesn't like people, but think of this. Nixon was always going on. Nixon was a bluster, and he would say, I hate Harvard. No more Harvard bastards. But who are his chief advisors? Harvard professor Henry Kissinger for foreign policy, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Harvard professor for domestic advisors. It is a domestic advisor. So he wanted very smart people. And Kissinger was really smart. Nixon had an extremely ambitious foreign policy agenda. He needed somebody smart to execute it. He understood that Kissinger was that guy. So even though Kissinger had worked for Democrats and for Rockefeller, he hired him.
So when he interviews him, does he actually make the offer of the job?
Typical. Kissinger's in there and he can't figure out what the hell Nixon's talking about. Nixon's kind of wandering around, and a couple of days later, Kissinger has to ask John Mitchell, who was the campaign chairman, am I being offered a job? And Mitchell goes, oh God, he blew it again. I mean, it was Nixon was so painful for him, he couldn't even offer the guy a job.
Let's talk about China for a moment. Was the idea to open up to China, was it Kissinger's or was it Nixon's? And did Nixon feel he got enough credit for that?
It was Nixon's idea, clearly. He got it a little bit from Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer. It wasn't totally his idea, but it was his idea. It wasn't Kissinger's. In fact, when Kissinger was told by Haldeman, the boss wants to go, is going to try to go to China, Kissinger's response was, fat chance. However, Kissinger was a brilliant executioner of Nixon's idea.
So at one point, Time was going to have as the man of the year, not your publication, I think it was Nixon and Kissinger.
Yeah.
And Kissinger was very upset that he was going to be on the cover because he would upset his boss. What was that about?
Well, Kissinger loved publicity, and he was good at it, and he was better at reporters than Nixon, much better. And the famous White House tapes, the reason why Nixon put them in, when Nixon got in, LBJ had a taping system. Nixon said, rip it out. He didn't want anybody listening in on him. But after a couple of years, Nixon felt that Kissinger was getting too much credit, and he knew that Kissinger was going to write his memoirs, and Nixon wanted to be able to rebut Henry Kissinger with his own memoirs, and he wanted a record. And that's why Nixon put in the taping system, was to be able to rebut Henry Kissinger's version of events.
Now, the Vietnam War negotiations finally led to an agreement, and Lee Duc-Tho, the Vietnamese negotiator, and Henry Kissinger win the Nobel Peace Prize. Did that upset Nixon?
Sure it did. Everything about Kissinger upset Nixon. But he tried to be philosophical about it. What really upset Nixon was not that, but that Kissinger was going over to Mrs. Graham, my old boss, Katharine Graham's, for dinner, and with the East Coast, the Georgetown set with the Harvards and the Yales and all that, and having fun, making fun of Richard. And of course, this got back to Nixon, and it was wounding to him.
Now, let's talk about for a moment, before we get into the ultimate subject of Watergate, Pat Nixon. What was that relationship like?
Very touching to me. We know these photographs of Mrs. Nixon, and she looks drawn and severe and unhappy. And she was unhappy at the end. But, that was a real marriage. The love letters between them when they're young are palpable. I mean, they're very real and endearing. And she stood by him. He would play this game, I can't take it anymore, I'm quitting. And she would say, no, you can't. She would bolster him. Even though she hated politics, she would bolster him and get him back in. He was devoted to her. Now, in the last year of Watergate, I think the marriage was strained. According to Julie, they were both drinking too much, both President and Mrs. Nixon. And I noticed that when Nixon decided to resign, he delivered the news first to Rosemary Woods, Nixon's secretary, and then she told Mrs. Nixon. How close could that marriage have been in August 1974? Nonetheless, one last thought on this. After he was driven out, they became close again. And if you look at the video of Nixon at Mrs. Nixon's funeral, he's not just crying, he's sobbing, he's bawling. He missed her. So
Nixon's re-election team apparently decided to break into the Watergate. What was that all about?
My flip answer to this is damned if I know. It was the stupidest thing, and Nixon saw it as stupid. Nixon did not know about the break-in. Nixon found out about it after the fact. His crime, and it was a crime, was the cover-up, not the actual.
So he got reelected in a landslide against McGovern in '72, even though Watergate had occurred before. Why did Watergate not hurt him in getting reelected?
Because people treated it as a third-rate burglary, which it actually was. It was the cover-up that ended up nailing them, and assorted crimes around it. It wasn't just Watergate. There were other things that Nixon was up to that were wrong, and he got blamed for it.
And Nixon thought that he did not participate in the cover-up, or did he later actually kind of admitted he did? Did he ever actually admit that he had participated in it?
Not really. David Frost tried to get him to admit, come on, admit that you've done something wrong. And Nixon did say, I gave them the sword and they stuck it in, and I would have done the same. So that's as close as he came, but he never admitted moral culpability.
Did he ever have any choice about not resigning? In other words, the political support just evaporated? Is that
totally evaporated. I mean, he would have hung on to the bitter end, but it would have put the country through hell. And he was just out of votes. I mean, he was counting votes. That's why he gave up.
So when he decides to resign in August of 1974, Why did he pick, by the way, Gerald Ford to be his successor to Spiro Agnew, who had to resign?
Well, initially, he picked Ford because he thought since Ford was weak on foreign policy, people would not want to get rid of Nixon and put somebody who was weak on foreign policy. Big miscalculation.
So he resigns, he goes back to San Clemente, and what does he do? How does he reinvent himself?
He writes books and goes on TV. But he's broke. You know, actually, he's so broke that Tricia and Eddie have to loan him their life savings. I mean, he was having trouble making grocery money.
And what about the pardon? President Ford gave him a pardon. Was that something Nixon wanted?
Oh, yeah. Nixon, he was cranky and difficult about it because a pardon is an admission of guilt, legally. Nixon, of course, never wanted to do that. But sure, he wanted a pardon because he faced millions of dollars of legal fees, criminal trial. Yes, it was a brave thing that Jerry Ford did to give him that pardon. The largest one-day drop in approval ratings was Jerry Ford giving Nixon a pardon.
So Nixon ultimately gets back financial health, and he makes himself into an advisor to presidents. How does he do that?
He writes a lot of memos. Well, at first they don't want him. He's toxic. Carter doesn't want Nixon around. Doesn't even want him staying at Blair House. But over time, Nixon, who was relentless, never gave up, and starts sending memos to Reagan, particularly, and they're useful political advice. Nixon had a good political head. Some of these memos, as I read them, are kind of professor of the obvious stuff, but still, you know, Nixon kind of worms his way. That's the wrong word. Nixon works his way back in to the graces of presidency.
So if you were to give an elevator speech on what were the great accomplishments of Richard Nixon, what would you say they were?
Well, go for the country going to China, being a fairly active president on domestic policy as well. He introduced welfare reform, didn't pass, but he introduced it. Détente with the Soviet Union, first arms control treaty with the Soviet Union. He was, I think Nixon would have been on board for a deal with Iran today. He believed in reaching out to your enemies. So I give him full credit for that. Personally, this shy, awkward man was one of the most successful politicians in the 20th century. He was on 5 national tickets. Only FDR did that. He won 4 times. In '72, he won by one of the greatest landslides in history. He won 35% of Democratic votes. The Republican Party has disowned Nixon. They should look a little closer at him.
And today you would say that his biggest failing was not destroying the tapes. In other words, suppose the tapes had been destroyed upon the day that they were announced. Do you think he would have survived?
Yes, he would have. But his biggest failing was his inability to confront his subordinates. Watergate happened not because he was this evil mastermind conspirator. It happened because his shyness and his dislike of confrontation, he could not bring himself to get his aides in one room and say, what happened here? We're going to get to the bottom of this. Let's get it done. He never could bring himself to do that.
So in the end, you would say that Richard Nixon's greatest contribution to our country was what? China.
Yes.
And his biggest failing, and what Americans should learn about Richard Nixon and why they should read your book is?
Don't hate your enemies. It will destroy you. Those were his last, as he left the White House, his last words were, if you hate your enemies too much, it will destroy you. Too late.
Right. Okay, let's have some questions from our guests. Right here.
Evan, this is not just for this book, but all your history of writing about presidents. When a president gets in for more than one term, usually the initial term, he's got a lot of supporters that have agendas.
Right.
And so that first term, it happened in Roosevelt's era, it happened in Eisenhower's. So when Nixon got in, either as vice president or president, there must have been a lot of people trying to push him a certain way. And then the second term, he decides to be more independent. Is that typical of your
Well,
research?
I wish it was typical. You always hope in second terms this is going to be the term that the president does the right thing.
Yeah.
You know, that they cut entitlements or they do something heroic. But second terms, our presidents seem to run out of gas. They get into little stupid scandals. I mean, Reagan's second term, he just seemed exhausted. Clinton's second term, Monica Gate, go down the list. Second terms are disappointing. Nixon never finished his second term. He was driven from office.
Mm-hmm. So that's typical of your
That's been the pattern.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes.
Yeah, some historians have suggested that one of the reasons that that President Nixon so mishandled Watergate and the investigation was his concern that his efforts to undercut President Johnson's peace agreement in Vietnam, which has been talked about, was something that he was desperate to conceal. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, this is a complicated story. I'm going to try to make it simple. In 1968, as we're getting close to Election Day, Nixon is ahead, but Humphrey's closing. And President Johnson says, okay, bombing halt, peace talks in Paris, and he does that for foreign policy reasons, but Nixon is afraid that that will win Humphrey the election. So Nixon secretly sends signals to President Thieu of South Vietnam saying, hang on, wait for me, you'll get a better deal from me. Johnson hears about this and he says, that's treason. Now, Johnson never exposed this because of this kind of rule of mutual assured destruction between presidents and because the country couldn't take it. And the facts, as I just told them, look pretty ugly. They look like treason. But as scholars get into this, the complicating detail is that even if Nixon had never sent a message to President Thieu wasn't going to make any deal. That wasn't going to happen. There was never going to be a peace deal in November 1969 because the peace deal would have included the end of President Thieu, and he wasn't going to go for that. So even if Nixon had done nothing, it wouldn't have made any difference.
Okay.
In your book, you mentioned his depressions. As a psychiatrist, I'm wondering whether he would have been diagnosed as having bipolar disorder. You also mentioned that he was treated with Dilantin, which is a mood stabilizer.
Yeah. I'm not a psychiatrist, obviously, so I don't know. People call him paranoia, but that's sort of a glib lay term. I don't know whether he meets his psychological. Obviously, he was psychologically troubled. He couldn't sleep. He was tortured by his enemies or his imagination of his enemies. But he was pretty high functioning. He ran the United States. You know, he was insecure and driven, but that describes every successful politician I've ever heard of. You know, you have to, great men and women are often driven. What are they driven by? Their insecurities, and often clinical ones. I mean, apparently Churchill was manic depressive, the talk of the black dog. Lincoln apparently had a touch of manic depression. We shouldn't be shocked by that. To want to do great things, you have to have delusions of grandeur. You have to be able to wake up every morning and think, I'm going to make the world better. Most of us don't wake up thinking that. You have to be driven. Now, this is wonderful in the uplift part, but as you know, often with the lift comes the down. With the up comes the down. And with many of these great figures, there was a significant
Well, he did have
down.
a psychiatrist treating him, but not for psychiatric issues?
He did. He was an internist when he first went to him. This guy said that he never wanted Nixon to know that he was in analysis. He wasn't really. I think they just talked. He prescribed, this is the 1950s. So they described a barbiturate-based thing called Equinil, which was later taken off the market. He took Seconal, a barbiturate-based sleeping pill, a cocktail of drugs that would never be prescribed today. But in the 1950s, after all, remember, JFK had a doctor called Dr. Feelgood who was giving him shots full of, I think, amphetamines, barbiturates. I think, Bob, what did JFK say? I don't care if it's horse piss as long as it works. So the medical standards were a little different in the 1950s and 60s.
Okay, next.
Thank you.
Could you tell the story of how Nixon and his wife met?
Yes, it was at a play. Nixon, the shy Nixon was an actor, and the shy Pat was also an actor. And Nixon fell in love with her. They were in a play called Dark Tower in the 1930s. And Mrs. Nixon was playing a sultry heroine, and she was sultry. She was about 15, 20 pounds heavier then. She was a knockout. She was a teacher in school, and the schoolboys would whistle at her when she came around the corner. And Nixon was smitten right away and got into a car with her and said, I'm going to marry you. And she kind of, what? And Nixon was so relentless that he would drive her on dates to other men for 2 years. And finally, she said yes.
Persistence will get you something, okay? All right, I'm sorry, right here.
What do you think of some analyses that compare some of Hillary Clinton's personality traits to Nixon's, and is establishing a private email server as Secretary of State a Nixonian thing to do?
Next question, not next.
Mrs. I used to cover Mrs. Clinton for Newsweek in the 90s, and I remember literally sitting with her in the White House and thinking that she had a sense of aggrievement and a kind of a bit of a chip on her shoulder. Now, having said that, who wouldn't when you have the press banging on you all the time, including the people sitting in the room that day from Newsweek? We were talking about Whitewater. So I guess I don't blame her, but I remember having that sense of her being tense and aggrieved and angry. I don't get that from every politician. Certainly didn't get it from her husband. And that is a little bit Nixonian. I don't want to exaggerate this. Mrs. Clinton is not Richard Nixon. You know, the emails are not the tapes. But we are going to have a series of little scandals that are going to bump along here for a long time. And the way Mrs. Clinton handles them, we're going to learn something about her. And for her sake, I hope she doesn't behave in Nixonian ways.
Okay, next.
Evan, you were talking about his famous quote when he was saying goodbye to his staff about how if you hate your enemies, you will destroy yourself. That was a pretty self-reflective comment. When he left office, did he become more self-reflective, and did his behavior change at all?
No. I mean, it was so hard work. He was not. I was fascinated by this issue of self-awareness, because I think to be an effective leader, you do need some self-awareness. But I'm aware that a lot of great leaders are not very self-aware, because if they were self-aware, they couldn't be great leaders. You need to have the blinkers on. I'm going to do it. And Nixon was really that way. I would ask people, was he self-aware? And I remember asking James Schlesinger, who had been his Secretary of Defense and head of the CIA. Schlesinger said, no. And then he looked out the window and he said, who is? Fair question. And then I remember asking Scowcroft, and I said, do you think Nixon knew himself? And Scowcroft said, no, but every once in a while he would take a peek.
Okay, next question, and we'll have one more after that, and that's it, okay?
Hi. Richard Nixon served as vice president as well as president. How did he treat his vice presidents that served under him?
Badly. He picked Spiro Agnew to be vice president and basically cut him out until he wanted to use him as a hitman. He picked Agnew because he was a moderate Republican in the days when they existed. He had stood up to some black militancy like that. He was a good speech maker. But he didn't respect him intellectually at all, didn't think he got good advice, and cut him out until he wanted to give speeches. He wanted speeches given attacking the press. And so he put him out in the trail, got his own speechwriters, Sapphire and Buchanan, and they wrote these memorable alliterative speeches about the nattering nabobs of negativity that made Agnew famous.
But Agnew, I thought, had to take a month or 2 or 3 sometimes to get an appointment with Nixon. He couldn't just go see him.
Right. And Agnew felt aggrieved and cut out.
Okay.
Agnew, it turned out, was taking cash in brown paper bags from Maryland contractors, so good thing that Nixon didn't get too close.
Last question.
I want to thank you, Mr. Rubenstein, for
thank
a
you.
wonderful conversation. You've obviously done your homework. My question is, how do you explain Nixon's anti-Semitism?
Well, it's a fair question because it's on the tapes. You can hear it. It's pretty ugly. And his aides are very defensive about this. You know, they say, well, he was a friend of Israel, and he was. Golda Meir was truly a friend of his. But those remarks are odious when they're counting the number of Jews in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You know, you go, oh my God. Some of it was generational, some of it was reflexive. Nixon was a blurter and a blusterer. He says a lot of ugly stuff on the tapes. His aides say, oh, he didn't really mean it. You know, you listen to those tapes and you cringe. Now, look, Kissinger, obviously, his advisors are Jewish. Nixon had a streak of hate in him, and it's a sad, ugly side of him. It's there. You can't pretend that it isn't.
So, Evan, this is an extraordinary book. To those who haven't read it, I highly recommend it, Being Nixon, and I want to thank you for a very good conversation.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.